individuals for outstanding contributions to the study of human-computer interaction. This award recognizes the very best, the most fundamental, and influential research contributions. It's awarded, as the name indicates, for a lifetime of innovation and leadership and carries an honorarium of $5,000. The criteria for the award are cumulative contributions to the field, influence on the work of others, and development of new research directions. One of the benefits of the award, and it's really a benefit for us, the CHI community, not the recipient, is we get to hear the award winner discuss their research in a format that's unconstrained by the narrow scope of a single paper talk. Which leads me to the introduction. Dr. Bob Kraut is the Herbert A. Simon Professor of HCI in CMU's School of Computer Science and Tepper School of Business. He's also one of the founding members of the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at CMU. Trained as a social psychologist, Bob's had a long and incredibly productive career examining how people interact with and through computers. His research has addressed online communities, the social impact of the internet, and the design of information technology for collaboration. Many of you are familiar with his research in the form of a very early, heavily cited set of papers about the effect of internet use on social involvement and psychological well-being. However, I personally first encountered his work in a paper that he co-authored well over a quarter century ago while at Belcour on a system called video windows. And he and his colleagues used wall-sized, wide aspect ratio display screens, video cameras, and mics to link two remote locations, basically making a forerunner of the really high-end video conferencing systems that all of us covet today if we don't actually have one of them. But the thing that to me was even cooler than that when I first encountered this work is that they were studying it not in the context of the formal, scheduled, expensive video conferences for which people reserve these systems now when they have access to them, but rather for impromptu, walk-up, casual interaction. So I still show a picture from that paper today to my students when I introduce and discuss cutting-edge VR and AR research on telepresence. Bob's work on online communities is covered in his most recent book, Building Successful Online Communities, Evidence-Based Social Design, and it's our pleasure now to hear him talk about his research.
Well, thank you, Steve, and to Kai for this award. I'm not sure it's as exciting as getting a Proxmire Golden Fleece Award, but it's up there in the pantheon. I did get a Golden Fleece Award at one time. When I was preparing for this, and I gave a talk not that long ago at Georgia Tech, and it was kind of the sort of talks that I often give, which is kind of a lot of depth about a small, narrow topic. And people said, kind of interesting stuff, but it's not the sort of thing that you want to do if you're trying to illustrate a lifetime of achievement. So what I'm going to do, rather than kind of narrow and deep, I'm going to go broad and superficial. So I'm going to be describing research that I've done off and on over the last 20 or 22 years that examines the influence of various sorts of online engagement on kind of psychological well-being. And this research comes from a long tradition in which commentators have talked about the utopian effects of new technologies or the dystopian effects, that they're the best thing since sliced bread, or they're bringing us down a sinkhole. And we've seen those sorts of commentation or commentary about the telephone that would allow you to keep in touch with anyone and reduce isolation, but it produces interruptions and it's less authentic communication than the face-to-face communication that it replaces. We've seen it with the introduction, so telephone, the predictions there were from kind of 1876. these predictions about the impact of television were from the 1950s. Again, the utopian ones, it brings the world together. It's a new way that you can have the best teachers in the world presenting to kids in grade schools, but it also leads to kind of violence, brings sex, drugs into the home, et cetera. So we're seeing these narratives all over. And we get the same when we're talking about the introduction of the internet, with the same sort of utopian, dystopian narratives. Even Pope Benedict XVI warned that the internet doesn't make people more humane, but increases risks of a sense of solitude and disorientation among the numbed young people. A large number of young people establish forms of communication that do not increase humanness, but instead risk increasing a sense of solitude and disorientation. So you're getting these kind of claims about kind of what the internet is going to be doing. On one hand, computer-mediated communication increases our communication choices and supplements traditional communication, making it easier to communicate with anyone we want to at any time. And this might be especially useful for people who are kind of lonely or socially anxious or have difficulty communicating in other channels. And by this approach, the internet use in general, computer-mediated communication in particular, and social networking sites, even more particularly, kind of build social capital and will kind of help people's well-being. The dystopian view that Sherry Turkle perhaps represents, or the Pope's quote that I read, is that computer-mediated communication is inferior to some gold standard of face-to-face communication, and because of time displacements, it shifts communication from face-to-face to mediated channels and from people who are close by that you care about to more peripheral people. And as a result, it should reduce social capital and lead to declines in well-being. So my research over the past 20 years has attempted to address these questions using kind of empirical evidence. So I'm neither a kind of social critic or commentator like Sherry Turkle, nor an enthusiast like Zuckerberg, but I'm an empiricist trying to use replicable research methods to identify how uses of various internet services changes people's lives at multiple levels of analysis. And today I want to review some of the research that I've done with colleagues about how the use of computer-mediated communication influences well-being of the people using it at multiple levels of abstraction. So what does it do to the particular communication sessions that are mediated by computers? What does it do to the health of social relationships that are at least in part maintained by computer-mediated communication? And overall, what does it do to the psychosocial well-being of people who heavily use internet technology? Research is a team sport. The research that I'm going to be talking about today, well, all of my research is collaborative, almost all of it. I hardly do anything by myself. In fact, I don't do any work anymore. And kind of having this wonderful set of colleagues and students that I've worked with over the years has not only allowed me to do and have some influence on kind of research, but it's what has really made kind of doing research over this long period of time so enjoyable. So people keep on asking me, okay, this is a Lifetime Achievement Award, is your lifetime over? And when I think about questions like retiring, the thing that keeps me back really isn't so much the research itself, but the process of doing research with people I enjoy doing it with. And so the people on this slide kind of represent a subset of them, and the ones that I publish papers that are going to be at least referenced or pointed to in this talk. Before I kind of go into the research itself, I want to point out two major methodological problems in the existing research on the effects of internet use on well-being. One is an over-reliance on cross-sectional data, and the other is an over-reliance on global self-report measures of internet use. The cross-sectional problems are ones that you all know about, that correlation does not imply causation. And in particular, cross-sectional data often confounds predisposition to use the internet for its effects. So, for reasons of time, I kind of took it out of this slide, but there's some very interesting research that looks at people's grade school and high school kids' social well-being in high school, and then their use of social networking sites 10 years later. And you find strong relationships. People who are more socially adjusted, who have more friends, who are in less trouble, who are less depressed, are heavier users of the internet later. And it's clear that their internet use 10 years later didn't cause those predispositions earlier on. And so you need to somehow deal with the fact that there's correlations between predispositions to use, and those can be confused with the effects of the internet. The problems of the over-reliance on global self-report measures of internet use is that people are not very good at self-reporting use of time, use of particular devices, use of durations when something happened. And there are many biases in their self-reports. And in particular, they fail to differentiate different types of use with different kinds of people. And if you really are trying to make the claim, which is what I will get to in this talk, that different kinds of use with different people are going to have different effects on people's lives, then you can't rely on self-reports of what people do, because they can't tease apart the various ways that they use the internet. So I'm going to be breaking the talk into three clumps, three outcomes. One at the level of a communication session, asking whether kind of internet-based communication changes the quality of the communication sessions themselves. Second, whether internet use changes the relationships between people who are connected through internet ties. And third, overall, whether it's influencing well-being. So in this first part, I'm going to be talking about the quality of communication sessions. And I'm just going to be kind of walking through a set of relatively small studies and hope cumulatively that the main trends will come across, and then I'll summarize them towards the end of the talk. But this first study that I'm going to be talking about come from data from a large national survey in which we asked people to describe a particular communication session that happened yesterday, the day before the survey. And we asked them to pick a computer-mediated session and another communication session. We asked them about the modality, the partner, the topic, the enjoyment, and the value of that session. And there's a lot of data here. I just want to highlight one observation first. If you ask how enjoyable was the session, what you see is that the two computer-mediated communication sessions are crap compared to communication that's conducted in person or by telephone. Kind of huge differences. So why do people do it, and why are these huge differences? So to examine kind of what leads to these differences and how enjoyable or how satisfying a particular communication sessions, kind of we look at what's the characteristics of the sessions that are conducted by small form textual communication, chat, and instant messaging at the time, email, or by verbal communication by the phone or visits. And first, one thing that accounts for these differences in enjoyableness is simply how much content gets generated during a particular session. And it's just the sessions that are computer mediated are shorter than the other kinds of sessions, and the amount of content that gets generated per unit time in those sessions is substantially less. So people talk at 3 times the speed with which they write, for example. But in addition, people use computer-mediated communication, at least in this survey, to communicate with people they care less about. So here it would be, so this is a graph asking people, respondents, who did you actually talk to in this session? And we had a taxonomy that it was close people, psychologically close, so close relatives, romantic partners, close friends, versus everybody else. And so for computer-mediated communication, for chats, it's around 42% of close people. For email, it's around 60% for close people. But for phone and face-to-face communication, but especially phone, it's dedicated to people that you really care about. So the computer-mediated stuff is shorter, and it's dedicated to people that you care less about. In addition, it's on less substantial topics. So as everybody here who uses Facebook knows that a big use of it is simply to kill time. It's a way to do nothing while your fingers are enjoying their exercise, I guess. In contrast with phones, which are used for kind of giving social support in this case. So again, it's how much communication is occurring, who you talk to, and the topics of communication that are probably responsible for this difference in the enjoyability or the satisfaction associated with the different communication modalities. In more recent work, I've been looking at similar issues in health support groups. So health support groups are places where people with often serious health problems and their caregivers get together to share information and experiences about the disease and to express social support for each other. I've been in particular looking at 2 cancer support communities. One of the things that has changed in the research that I did kind of 10 years ago and the research that I'm doing now is rather than simply asking people what their communication was about, because so much of this communication is online in public settings, we can directly look at large bodies of communication. And with increasingly sophisticated machine learning and automatic coding methods, we can code at scale kind of millions of messages to understand what's the content in communication sessions that are associated with enjoying a communication session or finding it satisfying. So the most common kind of communication in these health support groups is informational support, where people are providing advice, referrals, or knowledge to each other. So here's an example. Somebody doesn't know whether she should take her doctor's advice about getting chemotherapy. She describes her problem and then asks the community, what should I do with his recommendations to me that an unknown, unknowledgeable person have to weigh the small possible benefits of chemo against some serious side effects. And people respond giving substantive informational advice, so asking about additional tests that the doctor can do and how to interpret those tests. So that's what's happening in this one. In another kind of support that is being exchanged in these groups is emotional support, where people are exchanging understanding, empathy, sympathy, appreciation, caring for each other. So in this case, the one that's here, no one is exchanging information, but a new member of the forum is describing the stress that she's experiencing and the fear that she's experiencing of having just discovered a lump in her breast, and whether she should kind of talk about that to her son, who himself is ill with lupus. And the reply is not giving advice, but giving emotional support. I'm sending you healing prayers for you and your son. The waiting game is hard. Try to hang in there. I know that your son is so sick. You won't want to make it worse by telling him, but you'll do the right thing at the right time. So the focus is on emotionally connecting to people who are sharing similar experiences. We can measure these kinds of content in online support groups at scale, as lots of other kinds of communication. What I'm interested here is asking, well, what's the content that makes people find a particular communication exchange more satisfying? Rather than simply ask people how satisfied they were with an exchange, what we do is ask external judges to rate how satisfied a person is in an exchange that they participated in by looking at their follow-up posts to an exchange. So somebody asks a question or starts a thread. Can somebody explain this to me? The community replies. We don't allow the judges to see that. And then we ask judges to indicate or to estimate how much the thread starter was satisfied with the exchange that she's gotten. So they would see, thanks so much for all of your thoughts. This website is fantastic. Everyone here is delightful. So you get the sense that this person thought that that communication session was especially valuable. We then can take contents of what went on in the community replies and use that to predict the expressed satisfaction. And you get results that look something like this, that the more responses somebody gets, the more satisfied, the more satisfaction they express in their follow-ups. The faster they get replies, the more satisfied they are in their follow-ups. The longer those replies are, the more satisfied. The more both informational and emotional support that they receive in those replies, the more satisfied they are. And the more that they get replies from people who are similar to them because they have talked about similar things in the past, the more satisfied they are. The surprising result here is that the more I have seen this person who's giving me replies in the past, the less satisfied I am. We don't know if you've already heard everything that person has to say, and as a result, that communication is redundant, and so you're less satisfied with the redundant communication. Or is this simply a self-presentational bias that you no longer have to say thank you to people that you know? You just take it for granted. But that's the only surprising thing here. But we're seeing that, again, the content of what occurs in these messages seems to be associated with people's satisfaction with it. It's not simply what the modality was, but even holding modality constant, this is all text-based communication, communication that has more informational support in it and more emotional support in it, coming from people who are similar to you, is more likely to lead you to be satisfied. So content and who the partner is matters. Okay, let me skip this stuff. Does computer-mediated communication influence the strength of the relationships between people? Here, again, using longitudinal data, we examine the trajectory of social relationships over time. And in this first study, it's a study of, I think it was something like 400 college freshmen, incoming college freshmen. We get them in the sample their last semester in their high school year. We ask them to nominate friends from high school, close friends from high school, and family members. How much do you communicate with those people? How close do you feel to those people? When they come to college, we ask them to add some new friends from college into this sample, and then we repeatedly ask them about their strength of their ties with those people over the next 4 years. And what you can see is that kind of over time, the top blue line, people's relationships to their close family ties, their parents and their siblings, actually increases slightly over time. So it starts out as stronger than their ties with their friends, and it increases. On the other hand, ties with friends go south. They decline substantially over time. So your best friend from high school, your best friend from your first semester in college is somebody you barely recognize by the end of college. On the other hand, the amount of communication you have with those people kind of retards the decline in communication, or decline in closeness with these optional friend ties. So the black line shows your closeness to friends when you're continually having above average communication with them. And you're seeing that those relationship strength is actually increasing, much the same as your relationship with your parents and siblings is increasing. On the other hand, the bottom line that's going down is friends where you're not maintaining communication ties. So we're looking at communication at one time, predicting changes in tie strength down the road. And it seems like communicating with people substantially reduces the toll that time by itself plays on reducing the strength of ties for friends, people that you are not related to. Kind of more directly, I can show this by just looking across modality. So asking how much do you communicate with particular partners kind of over time in phone, in person, or email. Among this sample at this time, there wasn't enough instant messaging style communication, short form communication to be able to look at that. And what you can see here is kind of normalizing by holding constant communication at the first time period. The y-axis here is changes in closeness. So what you see is that the more you communicate with somebody, the more your closeness increases, but that affects, and that's true across all the modalities, but the effects are strongest for telephone communication and weakest for long-form text communication. So communication helps, and the interactive kind of live voice communication seems to be better than email communication in maintaining social ties. So these were studies that were kind of 10 years ago and longer. We replicated the style of research and many of the results using communication among Facebook users. So we had over 3,000 Facebook users rate their closeness to about 8 of their friends 2 or 3 times over a 3-month period of time. And we're predicting how much the closeness to those friends changes between one time period and the next time period based on the communication that occurs between those 2 measurements of closeness. So they're rating their closeness to about 26,000 friends, and we have about 40,000 change scores. So in a month, you're not going to have lots of changes in the closeness to your friends. But so if we find anything, it's a miracle, but we do find results. So we can differentiate different kinds of Facebook communication. So rather than simply asking people to describe how do you communicate with somebody, we can actually look at server logs to see how they actually communicated with them. And we distinguish between, at least for the Facebook communication, 3 distinct kinds of communication. Targeted composed communication. These are counts of communication that's one-on-one exchanges between a person who's filling out the questionnaire, whom we'll call ego, and the person that they're communicating with, we're calling kind of alter. So those might be wall posts, private messages, or a comment on somebody else's wall. We compare that to targeted stylized communication. So these composed communications, you're writing text to somebody, or somebody is writing text to you. For stylized communication, you're indicating that you care about somebody, but in a very, very lightweight way. So it might be a like, for example. So it's a one-click communication with very little content except for the valence of the liking. And finally, there's broadcast communication. Again, it's composed, you're writing text, but it's not directed to a particular person. Anybody in the writer's social feed can read that, so it's not targeted towards a particular person. And the fact that it's not targeted towards a particular person has 2 psychological consequences. One, the content isn't tailored to the person that you're writing to. It's just out there, and so it's likely to be less self-disclosing, less personal, less relevant to the person that who's going to be reading it. And it also represents that you're spending less effort. It's like the Christmas newsletters that you might have gotten at one time. It's useful to find out what's happening in somebody's life, but it's really not meant for you in particular. And so you can think about the effort involved in that is how long it took to write amortized over all of the people who read it. And even a shorter message directed to you represents more of an investment in you as a person. In addition to this Facebook communication, we have estimates of, self-reported estimates of phone calls, in-person communication, and non-Facebook computer-mediated communication. And like the graph that I showed you before, on average, more communication with a person in a month period of time between two estimates or two measures of how much you like that person is associated with increases in closeness and tie strength between those people. Phone and in-person communication seems to have larger impact than any of the Facebook communications, although there's a confound here of the way we collected the measure, self-report versus log data, and these results. So I'm not sure you should take that comparison seriously. But within the Facebook communication, where everything is log data, what we see is that reading about somebody's life, reading their wall posts, and communication that they wrote targeting you was associated with increases in the closeness that you feel towards them, while this one-click communication, the stylized communication, was not associated with increases in closeness. So there's some suggestion here, which you should take with a grain of salt, that modality might make a difference, but in addition, even within modality, this is all Facebook-based computer-mediated communication, the inferences that you're likely to make about the person, how much they care about you and how much information you're getting about them, both are what's associated with increasing liking for those people. Okay, the third part of the talk is asking how computer-mediated communication influences psychological well-being. And there's reason to think, strong reason to think, that the more interpersonal communication that you have with other people online, the better your well-being should be. But that's too simple a story. This research, which came from something that we called the HomeNet project at that time, started in kind of 1993, when the dominant narrative about the internet was it was an information highway. It was a way for people to kind of find out new information, kind of news, kind of entertainment, and that's what the bits were going to be used for. At the time, I just moved from working for the telephone companies, kind of whose historic mission was to support interpersonal communication among subscribers. And they were thinking about, well, how could they use the internet? How could they take advantage of the internet? What new services could they offer? And the only thing that they could think about that it would be used for would be kind of business communication and entertainment. So movies and ways of doing work. But in fact, even in these early days from our first research, we saw that interpersonal communication was a dominant use of regular people's use of the internet. In order to do this early research, we had to equip, I think it was 96 families, with computers and internet service and tell them what the internet was and give them training about how to use it, because the internet was locked up in corporations and universities at the time. So we were trying to see how it would be that once the internet escaped from its corporate environments, what was going to how is it going to be used and what consequences would its use have? But in order to ask that question, we needed to create an environment where the internet would be used. So we equipped these families with computers and the internet, and the first thing that we saw was that social interaction dominated use. So it was especially the case for, just like it was in the early days of the telephone for women and kids, were especially likely to use it for these social purposes. So they used it more for that, and the more they used it for that, the less likely they were to drop out of use. So it's not only did they use it more, but it sustained their use. So given that we're seeing that internet is being used for these social purposes, based on maybe 40 or 50 years of research, the straightforward prediction is that the more communication people have in their lives, the better off they should be. Social contact generally leads to health and happiness. So these are just some illustrative data showing the increase of likelihood of dying if you have few friends compared to people who have more friends. So people who are married, in frequent contact with family and close friends, are active members of a church or a club, if you think about their likelihood of dying in a 10-year or a 9-year period as one, then people who are below average on those measures have 2 to 3 times more likelihood of dying. So this is the sort of long tradition of research that says social interaction is good. It makes people healthier and happier. And as a reason, that research tradition is what made us kind of confident in our predictions that introducing internet use into residential households was going to make the users' lives kind of better by improving their psychological well-being. So in order to do this research, we compared heavy and lighter users of the internet on changes in their psychological well-being. Things like kind of depression, loneliness, kind of stress. Those would be negative indicators. Happiness, satisfaction with life, positive mood. Those would be positive indicators. And we predicted that internet use would lead to improved kind of well-being. But in fact, we found just the opposite. And that's why this kind of research, when it first came out, was billed as, or we called it the internet paradox. We expect social uses of the internet would lead to good psychological outcomes, and we're finding the flip. So heavier use of the internet predicted declines in communication with the rest of the household, declines in the size of one's social circle, decreases in perceived social support, how much support you think you can get from people in your social networks, declines or increases in your loneliness, increases in your depression, increases in your daily life stress. So the kind of statistical analysis looked like this, where you are looking at changes in, say, depression at 2 time periods, controlling for things that get people to use the internet, like kind of age, and other things that might be associated with changes in depression, like race and prior stress. And what you find in this example is that the more people use the internet, the more depressed they got. In these early days, we clumped together all sorts of different kinds of internet use, even though these come from log data, and we could at least distinguish between their uses of the internet for interpersonal communication, primarily email, and the use of the World Wide Web, which you might think of as informational uses. But we found no differences at that time period between using the internet for social purposes and using it for informational / entertainment purposes. And we think what was going on is at that time period, the only people, remember, we had to give people computers and the internet. And so if you're a kid in high school and you want to talk to people socially online, go to chat rooms, you're going to be talking to strangers because hardly anybody else in your high school has internet service. They were not part of our study. So at that time, social communication often meant communication with strangers. And we think that accounts for this sort of result. This got a lot of, at the time, press coverage. So it was front page of the New York Times, but the major results really were summarized in a bunch of cartoon panels. This one is, do you think there's anything about those reports about the internet making people more isolated and lose social graces? Says one person on the computer, and the other says, of course not, you idiot. We replicated these results, examining over a few years later, examining the effects of a year's use of internet use on changes in psychological and social outcomes, again controlling for the initial psychological and social states and demographic characteristics. Here we could distinguish between types of use, communication with friends and family, with strangers, informational and escape, and I don't think I'm talking about it, but we could also distinguish between people with fewer and more social resources. And what we find is that using the internet to communicate with people that you don't know, that's that green line, meeting people, so this is talking to new people online, was associated with increases in depression, while using the internet, same technology, in some sense the same kind of use because it's social, but using it to communicate with existing friends of family were associated with declines in depression. So social uses of the internet had different effects than information and entertainment uses, which didn't change depression, but those social uses depended on who you talked to. Are you talking to friends and family, in which case social uses of the internet seem to be associated with better psychological outcomes, or are you talking to people that you don't know well or complete strangers, in which case social uses of the internet are associated with worse psychological outcomes, in this case, depression. So I gave you earlier on a kind of general claim that more interpersonal communication in general should lead to better social outcomes, psychological outcomes. There's a set of more detailed theories that you can use to explain the link in a more detailed way between the kinds of communication that you might experience online and those outcomes. So all of these theories have some version of the view that the more social communication there is, the better off you are. Needs to belong, relational maintenance, signals of relational investment, mundane social support. Social comparison is just the opposite. It says that if you see people who are doing better things than you are online, you get envious and you turn out to be worse. So I'm just going to very, very briefly go through kind of each of these, just to give you a sense of how you might think about these theories as ways to make more detailed predictions about how social behavior online might be associated with changes in psychological well-being. So the need to belong makes the claim that social interaction of any kind makes people feel wanted and satisfies a basic need to belong. So just the same way that eating satisfies kind of basic hunger needs, social interaction satisfies basic social needs to belong. But this theory also makes the claim that need satisfaction is higher when social interaction is with stronger ties. So the prediction here is that the more you communicate online, especially with stronger ties, the better off you will be. You've had your needs satisfied and therefore will be having increases in psychological well-being. Signals of relational investment are saying that needs to belong are satisfied best with what you can think of as honest signals. Honest signals are ones where you have to invest a lot of effort in the communication in order to indicate that you like the person that you're communicating with. So the idea here is effortful communication provides better evidence of a tie, and that you like somebody, and therefore will better satisfy this needs to belong than will cheap talk. So this would say long-form communication would have better effects than short-form communication, and composed communication would have better effects than would stylized communication. Not necessarily because of the content of the communication, but because of the effort that you had to invest in the person that you're communicating with. Relational maintenance, so these are, as you can see, these are, there's only subtle differences between these theories. Relational maintenance theory makes the claim that communication grows and maintains social ties. For example, in order to maintain friendships, you need to know what's going on in somebody's life. You can't lose your mother because you're bound by genes to that person, so it doesn't matter if you communicate with your mother, but to communicate with your best friend from high school is the only way to maintain that tie. Otherwise, the ties dissipate over time. And this claim would be that the substantive communication, keeping up with people in that way, is going to grow and maintain ties better than superficial communication because it allows you to keep up with the details of their daily life. So this would make the claim that substantive communication, but it can be broadcast communication where you're telling that it's the Christmas newsletters or personal emails. Either one would have this effect of allowing you to know what's going on in somebody's life and therefore would improve psychological well-being. Another theory is that social support, which often is mediated through communication, leads to improvements in well-being. And perceived support, that's the thing that leads to these health and wellness outcomes. Perceived support derives from a history of actual received social support, but that received social support doesn't need to be the kind that we saw in the health support groups. It doesn't have to be people who are giving you strong emotional support. It could be kind of day-to-day interactions that indicates to you that somebody will be there for you when you need them in time of crisis. So received support comprises the everyday interactions, so minor, so commonplace, so taken for granted as to be virtually invisible as evidence of support provision. So this would say the more substantive communication, but it doesn't have to be from a strong tie, but substantive communication is going to be what leads you to have increased perceived social support, which is what leads to kind of well-being. And then This flip is upward social comparison. So comparisons to others who are better off can reduce your personal self-evaluation, while downward social comparison can improve it. So comparing yourself to people who are better off than you makes you feel bad. Comparisons to people who are worse off than you makes you feel good. Because people often present themselves positively in online social environments like Facebook status updates, they're generally showing off their good side online. And so if you're reading their status updates, you find out, well, I don't know if there's anybody who's from Facebook PR in the audience, but I have a PhD student, Ija Wang, some of her research was on self-disclosure on Facebook. And people are much more likely on Facebook to report that they've just entered a new social relationship, and much less likely to report and less self-disclosing that they've just broken off. So you're reading other people's posts, you find out that they've gotten new jobs, and they've gotten kind of new nieces and nephews, and they've just gotten married, and you never find out any of the bad things that are happening in their life. So if you kind of read their status updates, you feel bad because you know that your own life is a mixture of good and bad stuff, while everybody else's life is much more positive. The reason I was looking for Facebook plants here is because Facebook PR wouldn't allow us to kind of publish that. They forced us to withdraw it from a CHI or a CSCW submission because it would make Facebook look bad. But this would claim that if you're reading status updates of other people, especially broadcast status updates, that would make you feel bad and reduce your psychological well-being. So we can use these theories to distinguish, combined with surveys in which people are describing their well-being over time, to predict changes in well-being. Here we've got an aggregate measure of well-being, so we tie together perceived social support, satisfaction with life, positive affect are all positive indicators of well-being, kind of depression, loneliness, perceived stress, negative affect, which are all negative indicators of well-being, kind of do the appropriate reversal of signs, and take composite, which creates a reliable single well-being kind of latent variable. And then we can ask, what happens on Facebook between two questionnaire administrations that's associated with improvements or declines in this well-being measure? As I've already indicated, these kinds of Facebook communication, targeted composed communication, stylized one-click communication, and broadcast communication. This is kind of a table that I can share later that shows the relationship between these theories that I've just kind of illustrated with expectations about whether this kind of communication should lead to improvements in well-being. But in general, as you can see with most of the plus signs here, they're on average saying that the more communication online, the more improvements in psychological well-being there should be, but they make subtle differences about whether composed, targeted communication will have its effect, or whether broadcast that isn't meant specifically for you will have the same effect, whether stylized communication will have a similar effect or not. So I won't go into the details of this in this overview talk. In addition to measuring types of Facebook communication, we also measured who that communication is from. So we have a regression model, in the survey, people rated how close they felt to about 28,000 of their Facebook friends across the sample. And then we apply that model that predicts how much you like a particular person to all of your friends so that we can classify for the people in the sample, the 2,500 people in the sample, all of their friends. So we have a tie strength measure so we can distinguish people that you care about a lot from people that you care about a little based on things that you do with them on Facebook. And what we find is that overall Facebook communication with strong ties is associated with increases in psychological well-being, while overall Facebook communication with weak ties is associated with declines in this well-being. So very much like that earlier survey research that I described. And in addition, the effects differ depending on the type of communication. So these effects occur only for composed, targeted communication with strong ties. So talking to your friends online and having more substantive communication on Facebook is associated with improvements in well-being, and all other kinds of Facebook communication is not. We don't find strong effects that any of it is associated with declines per se, but they have different effects than the effects of communicating targeted substantive communication with strong ties. So I've kind of given you, as I said, kind of a superficial kind of overview of 22 years of research that has something to do with online communication and well-being at multiple levels of analysis. Asking the question, does the penetration of the internet into our lives, often used for connecting to other people, but not only that purposes, does it have larger effects on our well-being? The takeaways here are, one, that the internet is not a unitary technology, that the effects that we've seen across all of these studies that I've described depends on kind of what you do online and with whom you do it. So the internet is, in the 20 years that I've been doing this research, it changed dramatically, and it's still changing. And yet, even today, too much of the research is based on overly simple measures of internet use, hours of use, or kind of an internet intensity or a Facebook intensity scale. But these internet effects depend on what one does and with whom one is communicating. The substantive answers are that online communication seems to be less enjoyable and valuable than phone and face-to-face communication, but because it's easier to get to, people do it a lot. Online communication maintains friendships, but there's some suggestions here that it's less valuable for doing so than phone or in-person communication. But in the case of maintaining friendships, simply knowing what's happening in somebody's life seems to be sufficient. So substantive communication is what's important. Both targeted substantive communication and broadcast communication helps maintain those ties because you're keeping up with the details of somebody's life. And in addition, substantive and effortful communication with strong ties is what seems to increase psychological well-being. Substantive communication with weak ties doesn't cut it. And broadcast communication, where you're not investing a lot of effort into a particular communication partner, doesn't do it, nor does one-click likes kind of do it, and even with strong ties. So what are the effects of the internet? I've been talking as if there's kind of this technological determinism, but we've got a technology that can be used lots of different ways. And as a result, the effects of the technology depend on these free choices. But we as designers and service providers have lots of tweaks that reduce free choice. The same way that slot machines know about, manufacturers know about ways to have variable reinforcement to keep people pulling the lever, or TV schedulers know about laziness of couch potatoes so that they get you to sit down for one show and then realize that that will bleed into the next show that's there. Facebook has kind of notifications and algorithms that keep you coming back, something like a slot machine. So the kind of design choices are, I wouldn't say eroding free choice, but they're the conditions under which free choice is being exercised. And in that sense, it really is technologically deterministic. So there's free choice, but free choice in the context of a set of constraints that we as technology designers can control. I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob. Although the session technically ends right now, the next one is at 11:30, so I think we do have some time for some substantive face-to-face communication from the audience with our speaker. Please step up to the mics.
Congratulations, Bob, and thanks for a great talk. Jeff Hancock from Stanford. I'd just like to ask what your thoughts are for why communicating with weak ties can lead to declines in well-being. From all the theories that you laid out, there was nothing about weak ties leading to depression or negative effects, but you're seeing that early in your work and most recently, so thoughts there?
Yeah, so the more recent stuff just empirically is that we're not seeing declines in well-being with communication, but we're seeing improvements in well-being only with communication with strong ties. But to the extent there actually are declines, it could be a kind of time trade-off. So in the 24 hours that you have in the day, if you're devoting a certain amount of it to interpersonal communication, if you're devoting more of it to communication with weak ties, you have less time available to communicate with strong ties. It's not that communication with weak ties is bad absolutely, it's just relatively not as powerful, and it depends on what you do with your time.
Chris Priest from the University of Bristol. There's a lot of sort of anecdotal stories about strong ties developing purely through virtual relationships, particularly in communities of interest, where I assume initially it was obviously a weak tie. Have you explored that at all, and is there any evidence for when that develops and the benefits or otherwise of such things?
So we have not looked at that ourselves. It's more than anecdotal evidence. There's just lots of strong empirical evidence that you can form strong tie relationships, kind of at least start them online, and sometimes even maintain them kind of online. Oftentimes they devolve kind of offline after you find them online. So bars might not be the best place to find marriage partners, but many marriage partners start in bars. So you talk to lots of people there. And I think that's the same thing that's happening in many online environments. It provides an inventory of people that you can eventually form relationships with. Many of those relationships don't gel. A small number do. And those can lead to offline relationships, kind of marriage, work partnerships, lots of things. So what we're seeing throughout this is that more communication is associated with, between partners, is associated with kind of closer tie strength. It's just that you have to make choices about how you're going to allocate communication channels to particular people.
Okay, thank you.
You know me, but others might not. I'm Gregory Abott from Georgia Tech. Thanks for your attempt to be broad but shallow, but you failed miserably because it was way too deep, but we understand. I want to ask you a kind of methodological question, because it looked like most of the studies you reported on were doing these kind of pre-post measures on self-report, and I want you to comment a little bit on your opinion about whether ecological momentary assessments to get at states of individuals for these psychological factors, what value that might have in this kind of work.
I think, so you can apply this same pre-test, post-test, see what happened in the middle at different timescales. So the ones that I looked at were using kind of the smallest time unit was kind of a month. But think about momentary assessments. Your cell phone tells you who you communicated with during this day, and you've got a questionnaire at the end of the day asking how much do you like that person. And if what you want to know about are changes in relatively fleeting experiences, your mood, for example, then it's much better to use the smaller time scale, using the same methods, essentially pre-post with what, and comparing changes to what goes on in the middle, but doing it with a smaller time grain than what we've done here. But if you're looking at the growth of a personal relationship, maybe you need kind of longer time periods. So we're surprised that we've found changes in a month. And we're better off at looking at changes throughout high school from college when students first come in to when they graduate 4 years later in order to see these declines with the lack of communication among friends.
Mark Schlager from Google. I've been following your work for many, many years. And I'd like to ask you if you could speculate on sort of a different aspect of these college students and high school students. For as long as this internet research has been going on, there's also been research on online learning and with protagonists and antagonists. And now we've gotten to the point where we have this, these technologies that can have thousands of students in a single class in MOOCs. Can you speculate on the effects that those kinds of class environments might have with strong and weak ties and the effects on students' ability to learn in these classes?
Yeah, so I think the intersection that I would just mention is in kind of regular classrooms. So in general, I think there should be, the classic literature on distance education is that it's as successful as in-class education. The problem with MOOCs is that everybody leaves, and so they're not in either the distance classroom or the regular classroom. And so that's its real problem. And one of the ways that you can increase their likelihood of sticking around is the interpersonal ties that people are likely to form between classmates who are taking the same course at the same time. And organizing your online course so that interpersonal communication is a necessary part of it. It's not just a student reading or watching videos, reading material and answering quizzes, but it also has interpersonal components to it. That might be project-based learning, team project-based learning, that would supplement these other things. Not only do I think it's likely to increase learning, that team-based, project-based learning, but it will decrease the attrition that is such a problem with MOOCs.
Yes, hi, Bob. My name is Brian Hall from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Fascinating just looking at all what you've done and how you've gone throughout the years. It's really been very enjoyable. But I wonder, you sort of talk about online contacts and so communications with people almost as though the just communicating with someone is a positive. And I know certainly at a personal level, sometimes we know more about someone and we go, oh, I want to know more about this person. Whereas others make you realize you have no idea why you like this person in the first place and why are you ever talking to them again. So I wondered if you could, did you see that? Just communication is inherently positive, or does it actually a catalyst for pulling people apart that maybe shouldn't have been together in the first place?
We hardly ever saw in the aggregate that more communication is associated with pulling people apart. Certainly it happens in individual cases, but in the aggregate, more communication with people is associated with increases in the strength of their ties. Partly this is kind of a causal effect, that you're learning about them, you're kind of building commonality with them, and partly it's a selection effect. As you said, early on you discover through communication that there's no reason to invest further in this particular person.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Gina from Microsoft Research. In the last bit of your presentation, you talked a little bit about, as designers, we have these levers, or you call it designer alternatives, for us to influence the online communities. And in your book on online communities, you purposefully left out the ethics and morals of these designing of online communities. And I thought that was very interesting, and I wanted to know if you had any comments, or if you have ideas of when is the right forum to talk about these things.
Well, so on Monday, or on Sunday, there's a kind of new SIGCHI ethics working group that met that was kind of dealing with some of these issues. And so I think there's going to be a readout today at the end of at the SIGCHI business meeting about some of that. But kind of ethics, I'm not trying to be a situational ethicist, but if you think about human subjects research, which is people have kind of reasonable expectations of what's going to happen, and violations of those expectations are often what makes kind of some research unethical. People's expectations are radically changing. You know, people are willing to give up huge amounts of private information about themselves for the benefits that they perceive that they are getting from that private information. They let Google know everything about what they are interested in because they get good search results. They let Facebook know an awful lot about their social life because they want to share it with friends, and then Facebook can reuse that information for targeting ads. So people give up their bank account information because it speeds financial transactions. So people are continually making trade-offs about what they're willing to put up with for the benefits that they perceive themselves as getting. And those trade-offs are changing substantially with changes in technology. So I don't have any brilliant answers for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Ben Schneiderman, University of Maryland. Thank you for your long, wonderful career of contributions and your courageous talk today. You said during your talk that being on Facebook is like using a slot machine, and you said being on Facebook is doing nothing. It's not like doing nothing, is doing nothing. So those are strong statements. Now, I think the takeaway for Facebook users is spend time with your strong ties with your family, talk to your mom and dad and friends, and stay with it. But what would be your wish for Facebook to change in their way? Or is there a room for another replacement for Facebook based on the model of your research?
Well, the way I use Facebook, and I might be abnormal, is I keep up with close family. So it's how I see what's happening with my grandkids' lives. So again, the technology is in some sense neutral, and it's kind of biasing you towards particular kinds of actions. But if my son didn't post pictures of his kids online, I couldn't see it, and I would not find out what's happening in their day-to-day lives.
So that's focusing on the users of Facebook, but I'm asking specifically what you would like Facebook to change to promote a higher quality of relationships.
Well, as of 3 days ago now, I am a very part-time Facebook employee, so I'll be able to have some impact from the
I hope
inside.
you will. Thank you.
Hi, Kate Meyer from Nielsen Norman Group. So I kind of wanted to circle back to the introduction of your talk where you talked a little bit about prophecies surrounding technology. There's a lot of...
I missed the first part of that.
Sorry, just wanted to circle back to the introduction of your talk where you were discussing prophecies surrounding technology.
Prophecies, okay.
There's a lot of moral panic about today's young adults and growing up with access to this technology and social media. I know that wasn't the focus of your research, but I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit if you had any insights.
Yeah, most of our research has not focused on kids, although that first HomeNet project was, half of the sample was kind of high school age kids. I don't think anything that I'm saying here, once you get to the kind of 12 and up, and the things that I'm saying here I think are going to be relatively constant. What I don't know about was kind of the really young kids and what influence things are going to have on them. So I guess I'm optimistic enough with some of the same principles that a kind of a common device has lots and lots of different possible uses, and you have some control as users and parents of users about how your kids use that. And so that's what's going to influence the impact of those technologies, not so much that they're watching TV or have a cell phone, but that they're watching Sesame Street versus kind of violence on TV. So it really depends on those detailed use choices.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time to give one more round of applause for our Lifetime Research Award winner, Bob Kraut.